What's up, slashers? It's September 19th, and on this day in horror history, we're going to be talking about Giles Corey, who died 332 years ago today in the infamous Salem witch trials. Let's do it. So when people think of the Salem witch trials, or any witch trial for that matter, or witch hunt, people generally think of women being persecuted and accused, or even practicing witchcraft. That isn't always the case. Some practitioners of witchcraft and some of the accused are men, or were men, and Giles Corey is one of them. Giles Corey was an interesting case in the Salem witch trials. One of my favorite cases to look into. You know, most people in the trials were hanged, and who were executed were hanged, and some died in jail. Giles Corey had a very different kind of death. You see, Giles Corey refused to give a plea of guilty or not guilty. And the punishment for this was being pressed to death. Why? Because they couldn't take anything or try Giles Corey in court without a plea. Him being silent led to him being pressed to death. So let's get into his early life. Well, a little earlier than 1692 Salem. About 16 years earlier, Giles Corey had an indentured servant named Jacob Goodale, who he supposedly beat to death with a stick because he suspected him of stealing apples from his brother-in-law. And beating an indentured servant to death, it wasn't a crime considered murder in those days. It was more like he would just have to pay a fine. Corporal punishment was allowed against indentured servants. And Giles Corey, pretty much got away with it. And, some people, even John Proctor, who was one of his neighbors, testified that Giles Corey did admit to beating Jacob Goodale, and which eventually led to his death. This, again, was about 16 years earlier than the witch trials that Giles Corey got caught up in. So initially what had happened was his wife, Martha Corey, who was his third wife, was accused of witchcraft by the accusing girls of the day. So Giles Corey had thought that Martha was guilty of witchcraft. There was some things about her that he said was suspicious. Among those was whenever she was around, his livestock, cattle and others, would seem to be sick. So Giles Corey first thought that Martha Corey, his wife, was guilty of witchcraft, and he actually gave testimony to that, which helped convict her, which helped put her away, and eventually to death. Apparently, Giles Corey had a change of heart and realized that it was a mistake, but this happened after he was accused himself. So Giles Corey was accused and by Mercy Lewis, who said that his spirit and his self would come to her at night and torment her and beat her, among other things, bite, and ask her to sign his book, ask her to sign her name in his book. The book that supposedly they said people would be asked to sign their name over to the devil to become witches. So Giles Corey was accused of this by Mercy Lewis. When Giles Corey refused to give a plea of innocent or guilty, he, again, was pressed to death. So what happened was, adjacent to the jail, which is today the Howard Street Cemetery, Giles Corey was brought out into the field. He was laid out naked, stripped naked, and laid out in the field with a board put on top of him. And one by one, hour by hour, stones were placed on top of this board, getting heavier and heavier as they did it. Now, this is an excruciating way to go, to say the least. So Giles Corey, he was known for being a very tough, very stubborn, strong man, strong-willed, and he was having no part of this trial, and he wasn't going to give over and give a plea. The reason was, if he had given a plea, he would have lost his property. And not that he was trying to keep it for himself. Giles Corey was 81, I believe, at the time. So he didn't have much to go, but he wanted to leave it to his two sons-in-law, which he did, because being that he never gave a plea, they were never able to take his land, which was a common thing that they did to accused witches at the time, which was part of the penalty for witchcraft. So one by one, stones were put on top of this board that were placed on top of Giles Corey. And every time they asked Giles Corey to give a plea, he would only respond with more weight. Yes, everybody knows about more weight, and Giles Corey saying so. Giles Corey also, with his last dying breath, cursed Salem. He cursed the sheriff, Corwin, and the town of Salem. And apparently, death was not the end of Giles Corey. After his death, and for many years after, his curse apparently came true and plagued Salem. So even till today, people claim to see the apparition of an old man in Howard Street Cemetery going about the graves, just floating by, who they suspect and presume to be Giles Corey. He was placed in an unmarked grave, so nobody knows exactly where he is in that cemetery. So it very well could be that the apparition that people do see is Giles Corey coming to show himself. But another thing about his apparition, his ghost, is that it appears usually before a big event, like in the Great Fire of Salem, I believe, which was in 1914. So that fire burned most of the city of Salem, and apparently before it, they saw the apparition of Giles Corey. Now, another thing that was part of Giles Corey's curse was the deaths of Salem's sheriffs. Starting with Corwin, who shortly after did die of heart conditions, and from what I hear, choking on blood. Giles Corey's curse plagued every sheriff of Salem until 1991. Every sheriff who took office in Salem apparently died the same way, of heart conditions, and usually which came about mysteriously and out of nowhere. So this didn't stop until 1991, when the sheriff's headquarters were moved out of Salem. That is apparently what stopped Giles Corey's curse, lifted it, so to speak. So it was 332 years ago today, this September 19th, in Salem, Massachusetts, that Giles Corey was pressed to death. His death did not come quickly. His pressing took about 3 days. He was laid out in the field, and again, for 3 days, stones were piled on him every hour. He was allowed food and water. He was allowed the worst of bread, about one serving of bread one day, and 3 sips of water the next day, of dirty water the next day. And this was supposed to continue until he died, which he did 3 days later after being crushed. At one point, the weight of the stones was so severe, so heavy, that it was actually pushing out the tongue of Giles Corey. To which Sheriff Corwin stood on top of the stones on Corey, took his cane and pushed his tongue back into his mouth so that he can be asked again, guilty or not guilty. To which, again, Giles Corey would respond, more weight. So that is the story of Giles Corey. That is my This Day in Horror History. And I hope you liked it. I'm going to try to be doing more of these. And if you are into it, come on by. Stay slashing.